In this video, I'll show you how to make the Odalisque top. Align the fabric with the edge of the presser foot to create a 6 to 7 mil seam allowance, and sew the entire way around both pieces of fabric. Then, on the long edges only, fold over on the line that you've just sewed and do a pin stitch, which is along the outside edge. Then fold it over once more. This time we want a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and we're going to go right over top of that line of pin stitching that we just did. So now both pieces of fabric have this enclosed seam on both edges. Also, if you want, you can gently melt the edges of the organza. I like to do this just to stop it from fraying. Fold the hood part so that the right side is on the outside, and just match up those lines of stitching that we did before. I like to use pins to just hold it in place. And sew that with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And trim the edge a little bit shorter. This is just going to make it easier to do that French seam. Now turn it the other way around, and we're going to enclose that raw seam. We're going to sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. For the top, you're going to need a water-soluble marker. You could also use chalk. Draw dots in a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter grid. You can use the ones that are on the pattern or another grid if you have a cutting mat with a grid like mine. We're going to use shirring elastic and a straw needle. Measure your underbust measurement, not stretching the elastic, just loosely, and that exact measurement is how long each piece of elastic will be. So I'm starting 2 centimeters from the edge. That's because we need that seam allowance to make a French seam later. And add a bead to the front. Then put your needle through to the back and tie a knot. The bead is going to anchor this first stitch, so there's going to be a bead at the beginning and the end of every row. And I like to tie it 3 times just to be sure. Once that's tied, continue going up and down through the grid. Every third stitch has a bead, so I found that the most efficient way to do this was to add the bead and then load up all the stitches on the needle and then pull it all through. Add the next bead, go up and down through those stitches, and then pull it through when I was ready to add another bead. When you reach the edge, we're going to break the pattern. So you want to stop 2 centimeters from the edge. Even if it's not due for another bead, we are going to add another bead to the end just to anchor that final knot. So it's basically the same as the start, where the bead goes on the front and then you send your needle down to the back and tie it up. I'm just tying it to the last piece of elastic from the last stitch. And like before, I'll tie it in a knot 3 times. As you can see, the beads go on a diagonal slope, so we're going to alter the pattern so that we're shifting it along 1 each time, so that the bead is creating that diagonal pattern, but still on the beginning and the end rows, it'll be a straight line of beads no matter what. It does get a little tricky as the fabric becomes quite scrunched up to see where you're going, but that's why the grid is there. Once you've finished adding all the beading and the elastic, you can dunk it in some water to dissolve that dye, and then we're just going to finish that final seam. We're going to do a French seam, so with the wrong sides together, sew down that seam, then turn it inside out and enclose that seam with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. If it's a little bit tight with the beads in the sewing machine, you can also hand sew this part. To do the stitches by hand, go through with a running stitch and then go back to where you can see the last visible stitch. and then go forward again, and then go back through that last visible stitch, and continue this way. You're going to get a really strong stitch. Make sure you tie it 3 times at the end. Now when you put on the tube top, align it so that the 2 rows of beads are at the middle, and then take the hood part and put it together like this so that the right side is on the outside and the seams are on the inside. Now with the seams like this at the top, I'm going to make the French seams point in opposite directions. I just like to do that to reduce the bulk. I think it's more aesthetically pleasing too. That seam is going to be pinned to the seam on the top. Put the hood up on your head and you'll need 2 more pins. I'm going to attach it just above the bust point. And do the same thing on the other side. And we're just going to do a little stitch to tack that in place. It just makes the hood sit more nicely. It gives you a little bit more space around the face. But it still allows the top to be worn down over the shoulders and also around the neck. This is what those little stitches look like at the end. That one's hidden in the seam, and then the side ones are just very small. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments and I will help you. When you're finished, I would love to see a photo of it, and I will send you a custom tag with your name and my name so that it's like a collaboration between us. And you can sew that in your garment to finish it.